Hi class! This presentation is all about how carbohydrates influence our energy metabolism by triggering the release of insulin. 3 really specific things I want you to cue in on as you're watching is 1, how glucose is distributed and stored in the body, 2, how insulin influences fatty acid metabolism, and 3, what the term carbohydrate tolerance means and different variables which will influence one's carbohydrate tolerance. With all that being said, let's get started. All right, let's begin by saying that we consumed 60 grams of carbohydrate for breakfast this morning. So here's our 60 grams. We eat it, and into our body it goes. So it's going to go through the digestive tract, and all those polysaccharides and different carbohydrates in that 60 grams of carbohydrate, let's say it was from a bagel or from oatmeal, blueberry, whatever kind of carbohydrate it was, we're going to digest and absorb it. And by the time we absorb these carbohydrates, they're going to be in monosaccharide form, and they're going to be delivered to our cardiovascular system. So this creates an increase in our blood glucose concentration, which I'm going to represent by increase in BG, blood glucose, and we have the concentration brackets. So this situation here is necessary and required, but it is actually pretty stressful on the body and can be harmful if left undealt with. So the body has actually cued off the pancreas that glucose was coming, and so the pancreas is going to release the hormone insulin into the bloodstream to deal with that increased blood glucose concentration. Now, insulin is basically like a key, which is going to unlock the cells of our body to accept glucose. So we're sending glucose out of the bloodstream into our cells. And then this equals ATP because our cells are going to oxidize that glucose in order to create our energy source, which is ATP. Now, this is great. This cell can be a muscle cell, it could be a fat cell, it could be a brain cell, any type of cell that needs glucose right away to form this ATP. But not all our cells need that glucose right away. So what we do with other amounts of glucose that we're not going to oxidize right away is put it into storage. So where we store our glucose is called glycogen, and we have 2 different sites for glycogen in our body, and that is 1, the muscle tissue, which I'm just going to represent here by this tendon hooked to a small muscle. Okay, so here we have our muscle glycogen. And glycogen is a large branch chain, so I'm just going to make it kind of messy because it's a really branched molecule full of linked glucose units. So here we have glucose being sent into storage here, being sent for oxidation here, and then we have that other remaining site for glycogen, which is the liver. Okay, so in the liver, here's our glycogen, our large branch chain of glucose molecules, and we're going to just be sending some more glucose to add on to that structure. In our muscle glycogen, what's good to know is that in an average person, even if they're a little sedentary, they have about a 400 gram storage capacity for carbohydrates. So I'm going to represent that by this bar. So basically we have room for 400 grams of carbohydrates max in here. Now in liver glycogen, we have a relatively small amount of storage space. So in here we can send up to 100 grams or so of carbohydrates max. And again, this might vary from person to person, but not too much for the liver. It might get up to 130, but you can see we do have a very finite amount of carbohydrate storage space. And this becomes significant because what if we had been pretty sedentary recently because we had been working really hard for school, studying, and maybe we have a desk job, and then also we have been consuming a high carbohydrate diet for the last few days. Maybe it was someone's birthday, so we had cake and ice cream, went out to the movies, had popcorn and hot tamales. In that situation, we likely already had maxed out glycogen stores before we even ate the 60 grams of carbohydrate for breakfast. So in that situation, the body still needs to handle this elevated blood glucose concentration. So what's going to happen if this is full, so we're going to represent that here. Remind you that this was full in this scenario. And I'm going to change colors because this will be different. So we have our maxed out glycogen stores, but we need somewhere to put our glucose. So what's going to happen to that glucose is it's actually going to be delivered into the liver, but this time it's not going to glycogen, it's going to be converted to fat. So glucose is converted to specifically saturated fat. And this is done by the enzyme fatty acid synthase. Okay, so you've probably heard if you consume too much calories in general, whether they be from protein or fat or carbohydrate, they will get converted into fat. And this is specifically how glucose is going to be converted into fat. And this is good that we can do this because this increase in blood glucose needs to be handled. And if we can't handle it by oxidizing glucose, storing the glucose, then this is how we do it. And fat really has relatively unlimited storage space. Someone might be storing maxed out 2,000 calories of carbohydrate on their body while they could have 80,000 calories of fat stored on them at that given time. I mean, really, we could store as much fat as we needed to on our body until it hurts our health so much that it would kill us. But really, this is why our body just kind of defaults to storing fat because of how much storage space it technically has. Now, this is where I want to talk about that insulin hormone again. Because something we need to understand about insulin is that it is an anabolic hormone, which means it helps us build things. So it helps us build glycogen, protein, like our muscles, and fat, which is what we were discussing down here. And this is what I really want you to understand from this presentation is how insulin is going to encourage us to build fat. And the first thing it's going to do is it's going to actually decrease a hormone called, or excuse me, an enzyme called hormone sensitive lipase activity. So hormone sensitive lipase is in charge of actually cleaving fatty acids from a triglyceride so then we can then burn the fat for energy. If we can't cleave it, we can't burn it. So insulin just tells this lipase to slow down so we can focus on the priority here, which is stabilizing glucose. We're burning glucose more, burning fat less until this blood glucose is stabilized. In addition to fat building, insulin, I'm going to put a little asterisk here just to remind us this is connected, insulin is going to increase the activity of fatty acid synthase. So you can see that it's working in two ways to slow our fat burn and build our fat. And you might think this is a negative thing at first when you're thinking about it, and people tend to be a little bit afraid of fat these days, but this is actually a really cool way that our body manages our energy sources, and it's really important for us to get this anabolic building signal. If we want to build muscle, we need that insulin signaling. If we want to make sure that we fill our glycogen stores so our muscles have their energy, we need insulin. And if we need fat on our body, which we do, to have some energy reserves, we need insulin to work. So don't feel like this is a negative process. This is actually a very important process. It only becomes unhealthy if we are consuming too many carbohydrates, and so we are creating too many fats from our carbohydrates. And with that, we need to start to understand carbohydrate tolerance. You've probably had a friend or a relative who seemed to be able to eat whatever kind of carbohydrate they wanted. They could eat all the candy, all the pizza, all the cake, cookies, whatever, and they never seemed to gain weight from it. They stayed really thin and slender. And then you have a friend who says that they feel more jiggly right after they eat a milkshake or something like that because they just know if they look at a carbohydrate, it's going to make them gain fat. And there is a reason why there's these differences amongst people, and it does come down to carbohydrate tolerance, which is influenced by many different factors, but I just want to give you a general idea of what it is today. And so here I have this spectrum of carbohydrate tolerance. At the top here we have carb tolerance, which essentially is saying someone is insulin sensitive. So this means that as carbohydrates enter the bloodstream and insulin is released, not that much insulin is required for the cells of the body and for the body in general to listen to that signal and to take in glucose for oxidation and storage. So you might have blood glucose concentration on this y-axis here, and then you might have time after eating that 60 grams of carbohydrate we ate for breakfast this morning, time after we consume that 60 grams of carbohydrate on this y-axis. So here we're going to go ahead and represent that increase in blood sugar concentration from that 60 grams of carbohydrate. And then maybe like 2-3 hours later, we're definitely back to our normal blood glucose concentration of 70 to 100 milligrams per deciliter. Now, in order for this to happen, as we've been learning, insulin had to be released. So I'm going to represent insulin with a dashed line here. And this is not to scale by any means, but just to give you the general idea. So just to remind you, insulin, and this is your blood glucose. Okay, so that is a good carb tolerance. We didn't require that much insulin, blood glucose got down in a good amount of time, and therefore fat burning wasn't inhibited for that much time either, because this was just a short spike. Now, at the other end of the spectrum, we have carb intolerant, which actually can be referred to as insulin resistant to some degree. You've probably heard that before. So someone who is insulin resistant initially is going to be producing a lot more insulin from the pancreas in order to get the message around to the body. So their blood glucose spike might look something more like this. Just takes a little bit longer to level out. And their insulin spike relative to this initial, or this carb-tolerant insulin spike, might look something like this. Again, this is not to scale, but just to give you the general idea. So here we have insulin, again, and blood glucose. So in this situation, when it took more insulin and a longer amount of time of insulin signaling, we have a lot more time where fat burning is stunted a little bit. So people with carb intolerance really do need to watch their carbohydrate levels pretty closely. Otherwise, they could be at risk for creating more saturated fat in the liver from glucose, just because of this insulin signaling being a little bit excessive, because it has to be in order to stabilize the blood sugar concentration. So this all being said, there are a couple other factors that will influence someone's carb tolerance. People who tend to process their glucose well, with minimal amount of glucose being converted into fat, will tend to be active, because this means that you have increased oxidation of glucose, which minimizes your chances that you're going to be overflowing your glycogen stores and therefore having to convert glucose into fat. And then people who are carb tolerant, if they are insulin sensitive and active, they also might have some lean body mass, or a good amount of muscle mass specifically. Everyone has lean body mass, but these people will have oftentimes a good percentage of their body as muscle mass, relatively speaking. So if you have more muscle mass on your body, you have potentially more glycogen storage for someone your size. And also, you have more ability to oxidize glucose, meaning you can also reduce your risk of overfilling your glycogen store and having to convert glucose to fat. So we tend to see these things hand in hand, but there are exceptions. Now, if we look down at this side of the spectrum, people who are insulin resistant might be more apt to be sedentary. So they're not burning through their glucose and their glycogen stores as much, therefore they're at a higher risk for their glucose to be converted into fat. Then also, we might see a high body fat percentage. Meaning they have lower amounts of muscle mass on their body, relatively speaking. And so they have less opportunity to oxidize their glucose, or less tissue that's willing to oxidize the glucose at a high rate, and they have a higher chance of overflowing their glycogen stores and having to convert glucose to fat. There are many other reasons why people can be insulin resistant and carbohydrate intolerant, but this just gives you a general idea. We've learned how carbohydrates regulate energy metabolism by triggering the release of that important hormone insulin, which is going to tell the body that glucose needs to take priority over fat burning until glucose has been oxidized enough or placed into storage to get that blood glucose concentration back down to a healthy level. So understanding this process is really empowering because now we can actually control our metabolism, or at least have an idea of how to control our metabolism through good, healthy consumption of carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are not bad. They can actually work with us, not against us, as long as we're consuming them from the right sources. Carbohydrates consumed from sources providing fibers and other nutrients that are in amounts that are appropriate for our carbohydrate tolerance and for our energy needs can actually be our friend, not foe.